The past 1 to 2 weeks have been quite eventful in the Total War community, and let's not whitewash it. It's been a big old mess. But if this mess is good or not can be debated. The quick rundown is that Creative Assembly is selling the next Warhammer 3 DLC for a pretty penny more than the last ones, but not really upping the amount of content. And as we speak, Warhammer 3 and its latest DLC are being review bombed into the ground in perhaps the most significant way a community can make its voice heard: Steam reviews. But the price itself is not everything. The sheer amount of uproar finally warranted Creative Assembly to release a statement regarding the price and the community outcry, but somehow managed to make it so much worse. So let's begin by going through this thing. And remember, if you enjoy my videos, then please consider leaving a like, a comment, and subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out. Essentially, Ron Bartholomew, the chief product officer at Creative Assembly, thanks the community for making their voices heard and that they're always listening to feedback. But then the nitty-gritty side shows up and saying only of the prices that they are rising because of rising production costs for CA. He also mentions that CA has kept the prices fairly steady throughout what I assume is the Warhammer 2 cycle, for example, which is true, but that since they now have to raise the costs, that the rise is felt equally hard. Senior Game Director Rich Aldridge then comes in and says a few words about how excited they are for the Shadows of Change DLC. Now this is where it gets interesting. CA presumably thought that this explanation would calm the community, at least hoped it would I guess, but it has in fact done the opposite. Whether from random redditors who are now flooding the Total War Reddit with constant feedback on the situation, the Warhammer 3 recent Steam review which is now well into the red, or massive Total War dedicated YouTube channels, the anger has risen to arguably never seen before levels. And all while this is happening, the underlying frustration with Creative Assembly not listening to its player base rears its head again, with channels like Pilps reacting strongly, saying let the series die, because Creative Assembly and Sega have completely forgotten what Total War even used to be, and that their profit margin doesn't reflect this need to take more money from people. I myself have for years now talked about CA's abandonment of a ton of mechanics that Total War used to do so well, but which have steadily fallen off the wayside, honestly for the past 12 years or so, most of which you can see right here on the channel. Thing is, while the Total War community is unraveling, other things are happening at the same time. First of all, and strongly related to the uproar connected to the latest DLC price, is the release of Larian Studios' Baldur's Gate 3, which has seriously taken the world by storm. Baldur's Gate 3 is recognized by virtually everyone who's played it, myself included, as exactly what games should be for the cost as asked. And that doesn't mean that every game needs to be Baldur's Gate 3 sized, of course, but it raises the issue that quality and content should match the asking price, at least much better than it does today. Because the problem the industry has been facing for a long while now is that two games can cost the exact same, but be wildly different in how much content and quality they are actually providing. As such, while it certainly is defensible and understandable that Creative Assembly takes full price for the entire Warhammer 3 game, it makes absolutely no sense that a DLC of the content caliber we're seeing should cost about half of the full game, when in reality, the DLC is probably about 1/20 of what the actual full game offers. Or perhaps even less honestly. And in a time when Baldur's Gate 3 really shows the way forward here, Creative Assembly's price move just shows the absolute dissonance between the prices executives think they should charge and what the customers believe they should be paying for their product. In this respect, even though it is far removed from the strategy genre and let alone the Total War series, Baldur's Gate 3 has miraculously had such a cultural impact that it's kind of knocked some sense into the mainstream gamer consumer and reminded them of what reality could have been if companies didn't rest on their laurels. And this is not to say that Creative Assembly developers are this or that. I will not participate in name calling and assumptions, and for all we know, executives and managers in both CA and Sega are running the show here. But it does mean that, and I truly believe this like Pilps mentioned, that Total War games have become progressively worse over the past decade. Because, and this is the tragic truth, Total War games are offering less than what they used to in terms of unique features, all the while CA becoming a larger and larger company with bigger and bigger profits. The tragedy is of course that Creative Assembly did its best work when it was an infinitely smaller and less known studio. And even though that doesn't mean that their latest games have been objectively bad or even actively bad, what I'm trying to say here is that their past games were better, that they ultimately ended up offering more, not just in terms of replayability because of fun, but in terms of role-playing opportunities. And this might be a bit of a tangent, I know, but I wanted to make clear that you understand what has led up to this point. It's not just the DLC prices at work, but also an underlying sense from much of the original Total War fanbase. The hundreds of thousands and even millions of people who played these games long before the Warhammer series and even before Rome 2 that Creative Assembly can do better, because they in fact have done better. I think it's fair to say that a lot of us considered Creative Assembly among their favorite studios once upon a time, and perhaps even continue to do so, because of the unique and extremely awesome and deep games they made. But in recent years, Total War has seemed more of a streamlined product than a meticulously crafted one. And again, it comes down to the removal of a host of mechanics that gave Total War games their soul, and replacing them with what de facto has become lights, smoke, and mirrors. And finally, the situation is made even worse by the fact that Creative Assembly itself is making a hero shooter called Hyenas, perhaps the farthest away game genre from Total War we can imagine. Now, for all anyone knows, of course, this game might succeed and even become Creative Assembly's and Sega's biggest cash cow. And personally, I don't even know if Creative Assembly developers that would otherwise work on Total War have been moved to Hyenas. But of course, if CA only did Total War, they would probably be working on that instead. Whatever the case, the idea that a hero shooter, likely based on loot boxes and microtransactions, is taken away from Total War and investments there also angers the fans. Indeed, another cause of frustration is exactly what Rob Bartholomew mentioned in his statement: Creative Assembly listening to its player base. Now, while it might be true that they are listening, I personally would have no idea if they were or not, because I don't actively hear from them. For almost a decade, people have been asking and begging for Creative Assembly to fix their games, to patch them to an acceptable level, but the opposite has happened over and over again. Ever since Empire Total War, Creative Assembly seems to have a broken game followed by a much better game, but with some important setbacks. Let's start with Empire. Empire is ambitious, massive, and refreshing, but was feature stripped, its development rushed, and its bugs never truly fixed. It received no DLC or patches that actually noticeably improved the game or its mechanics, and it took only 1 year before it was left to die. One lousy year for the next generation of Total War games on its brand new and updated engine. After Empire came a quote-unquote good game in Napoleon, in that it was patched and performed well, but overall, it was a smaller installment. And in both Empire and Napoleon, the shadows are still broken, flickering whenever you move the camera. Shogun 2 is a great game luckily, but I despise the removal of populations for each cities, which ironically happens in the first Total War game where food is an important mechanic. Rome 2 obviously broke all previous records set for its messed up release, but even after it's been quote-unquote fixed, it's still lacking a bunch of mechanics from previous games, and it has also implemented and gamified its systems to be less immersive and more streamlined. Attila was luckily a masterpiece of a game, but CA completely messed up its performance and left the game with both broken performance and broken shadows, the latter which not only flicker like crazy, but which also halves your alien performance from the quality to the high quality mode, and CA has never looked back. The issue is that the community has begged for fixes for these games for so long now, and to the best of my knowledge, never ever heard back. Creative Assembly might answer questions related to their brand's new title when there's community uproar, but it seems close to impossible to even get a whisper of a response when it comes to their objectively broken past games. And get this, when Attila was newly released and people complained about its performance back then, Creative Assembly answered that the game somehow was meant for future hardware, that the game would be much more enjoyable in a few years. Well, I played Attila back then on a laptop with a GeForce 970M back in 2015, and I'm having the exact same issues on a freaking RTX 4090 in 2023. So either CA must be talking about 2050 hardware, or they were saying very misleading things in what little community responses they were offering back then. All I'm saying is that even if CA's responses were that they have no plans of coming back to patch the broken old games that people paid full price for, it would nonetheless be preferable to have clear lines of communication with them. Creative Assembly, by intent or accident, has left the player base so disillusioned and so confused about what is going on with the Total War series, and it genuinely is baffling that it's been 10 whole years without a Rome 3, when considering it was already 9 long years between Rome 1 and 2, that we're still waiting for a Shogun 3 12 years after Shogun 2, that it's been 15 years since Empire with no Empire 2 in sight, and that we're approaching 20 years since Medieval 2, with no news or mention of a Medieval 3, by far the most requested Total War title in the past 10 years and counting. Now I understand not releasing sequels to your highly, and I mean highly requested series every year or even 3 years. But 10, 15, 20? Well, now it's getting kinda ridiculous. Of course, in the end, Creative Assembly is entitled to their creative process, no pun intended, and there is nothing I or anyone else can do to make them create our preferred game. But the thing is, I at least just wish the games they made these days had much more of that Total War DNA in them, which I genuinely think would have made the entire difference. It's like, I'm sure that I would have enjoyed playing Warhammer so much more if playing the Empire actually involved managing my population, actually involved regulating taxes and farming and production on a deep level, and not just revolved around simply making money and raising armies. Even though the end goal is largely the same in these two examples, in the Total Wars past and present, the process and the way there is completely different, and I really feel like it's high time that CA realizes that what made people like me love this series to Hades and back is not there anymore, at least the heart and soul. It feels mechanized somehow, and all I and others are trying to do is to help Creative Assembly, its developers and this series be as good as it possibly can, because so many of us so desperately want to love these games. Now, if there is one glimmer of hope here, at least that we know of, I truly think it ironically happens to be Creative Assembly Sofia and their latest game, Total War Pharaoh. And let me say this first. Pharaoh is not my preferred setting. I have comparatively no interest in the Bronze Age, and its reveal and subsequent trailers looked way too much like Troy than it should have. What historical Total War players want, and this is a historical title, is the heart and soul, the down to earth, and the details, while also having their games feel unique and tailor-made for that setting and theme, not copy-pasted from the past game. And even though it looked dark, and it still might be, well, it looks to me like CA Sofia is actually listening, and I base this idea on two factors. First, players and early access content creators based much of their criticism on Pharaoh's UI, namely that it looked like a carbon copy of Troy's, save a few assets here and there, and that armies were difficult to differentiate from each other, in part because the UI symbols looked way too similar and gamified than they should be. Well, first, CA Sofia showcased that they are actually listening by posting that they have revamped the Battle Banners UI in no less than 2 awesome ways. The boring and generic UI has been transformed into actual banners with symbols, making armies much more unique and recognizable. And second, and my favorite implementation, is that units themselves now have actual banner carriers, which to me is such an important immersive aspect. Second, and even more UI related now, are the unit cards. Pharaoh will still feature cards with 3D units on them just like Troy did, but CA Sofia actually listened to the feedback and now have fully customized and stylized unit cards that feel distinctively ancient Egyptian. The best part is that this is toggleable now, so you can choose the unit card version that you want. This is what happens when a developer actually listens to feedback, and even though I have yet to play Pharaoh and have my reservations about various aspects, it's extremely promising that CA Sofia has shown, especially that they've done this before release and not after, that they can actually change and that they value player feedback. Whether Creative Assembly ultimately lowers the price of the Shadows of Change DLC, or perhaps add more content, or do nothing at all, it is my plea that they completely change their approach to community interaction. The fact that bad apples are out there is regrettable, but that is the internet. You ban them and you don't take them seriously. The response is not to shut down communication altogether, but to take action where needed and continue to talk to people who genuinely have worthwhile feedback and who are passionate about your games. And I tell you, there are so many of us out there. Short-sightedness, the pursuit of short-term monetary gains, or the cutting of features to release a game on time, these are all the wrong strategy. I know I would have much preferred if Creative Assembly took the Larian route on their next Total War game, meaning they released it in early access for a lowered price, taking community feedback and actively working on their game alongside the community before ultimately releasing it when it's at least at a minimum acceptable standard and hopefully in great shape, having taken into account what the player base has actually wanted and asked for. I'm not one that wants CA to fail after all. In fact, I want the opposite. I want it to thrive, because I love Total War, but I love the Total War of old, and the Total War I know the series can be. Perhaps competition will be healthy for this series, but Lord knows a big budget and large teams are required to make games on the scale of Total War. But until then, the community is all we have. The fans that ultimately make this series both possible and profitable. And that's something Creative Assembly desperately needs to remember every single day. Because as much as the fans need Creative Assembly for Total War, Creative Assembly needs the fans. And in an age where communication is easier than ever, and the fans are screaming at the top of their lungs to be heard in legitimate ways and with legitimate concerns, it's time for CA to not only listen, but to also respond. Let's have it back and forth, and let's have it often. It's called communication, and it's honestly not all that creative. But what do you think about the issue? Can CA come back from this drama? Can Total War games return to where they were or surpass them? And can CA Sofia actually turn Total War Pharaoh into one of the best modern Total War games? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and please remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!